I never thought that humiliation could be wrapped in silk and champagne, served among smiles, like an exquisite dish, the aroma of which is more intoxicating than any humiliating word swallowed alone. But today I sat in the third row at my younger sister's wedding, among laurel garlands and sparkling glass, pretending that everything was happening has at least the slightest relation to me, dressed in the only formal dress I had. It was dark blue, slightly outdated, but carefully ironed, as if my honor depended on it, and I tried my best to fit into a room full of people who seemed too refined, too impeccable, too confident in their own rightness, as if they knew something about me that I myself had long avoided realizing. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. My son Luca was sitting next to me, his thin legs dangling under the round banquet table, and all the time he was adjusting the sleeves of a small suit, for which I had to pay 2 full salaries. Not because I couldn't find a cheaper one, but because I wanted him to feel worthy of all this splendor for at least one day, and he really looked so proud, so focused, as if all this magic had been arranged especially for him, and I, looking at his beaming face, aloud I thought for a moment that maybe this day would really allow us to feel like part of a family again, not a shadow behind the scenes, but something real. Beatrice, my sister, flew through the day like a movie star, her silk dress catching the light like the sea catching the sun's glare, and she always had such energy, bright, attractive, almost unbearable, like a too sweet smell that makes your head spin, beautiful, charming, adored by everyone, especially by our mother, who looked at her as if she was the crown of her life, the embodiment of all unfulfilled dreams, and it was she who received compliments, enthusiastic glances, endless attention. While I learned from a young age to live in the shadows, study do not interfere, do not pretend, do not ask, be just a background, a quiet confirmation of her radiance. But I came anyway. I was smiling. I clapped when they kissed properly. I kept my voice steady when people who happened to be nearby asked, with a hint of amazement, as if they doubted, "Are you an older sister? You don't look like you have an 8-year-old child," and I nodded, with that polite, detached smile I'd learned over the years, because it was easier than explaining, easier than arguing. Then came the speeches. The groom's best friend spoke first. His words were harmless, a little awkward, with a couple of slightly funny jokes, and polite laughter swept through the hall, as it should be in such cases when they laugh not at a joke, but to show that they support. Then it was Beatrice's turn, and I was sincerely, almost with trepidation, expecting something sentimental, something about love, about sisterhood, maybe about growing up together in our cramped home, and I even raised a glass in anticipation, maybe naively, maybe stupidly, but I was really hoping for a moment of recognition, a moment when I would finally hear something kind from her. She raised her crystal flute, thin as an ice thorn, and looked around the room with that brilliant smile that seemed to melt the candles on the tables, and said, "I want to thank everyone who came, and continue to glow like a jewelry showcase. It is very important for the world that you are here. And, of course, I want to say something special about my older sister," she said, and I turned to Luke and smiled at him. He was looking at me with admiration and excitement, as if a hymn dedicated to our lives was about to be played. But Beatrice continued. She was such a role model. A single mother, strong, independent, and clearly useless to anyone. The room froze for a moment, then burst into laughter, the kind that doesn't cheer, but peels off the skin, and my stomach turned over, as if something inside had snapped and splashed with cold. At first I thought I had misheard her, but she was still smiling, calmly, confidently, as if she had just told the most charming joke in the world. Some of the guests averted their eyes, while others laughed louder, clinking glasses, as if this was a funny game, not a mockery. I didn't know where to look, my eyes were racing, my heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear the music. Luca tugged at my sleeve, his voice thin and worried. "Why did she say that about you, Mom?" Before I could find the words, before I could come up with something that wouldn't destroy his faith, my mother, without wasting a second, loudly added from behind her desk, "She's a used product, but hey, she still looks good for her age." And then the laughter became different, sharp, cutting, like glass shattering into pieces, and I realized that it wasn't just laughter, it was the moment when everyone realized who I was. Not a guest, not part of the family, but entertainment, a reason for ridicule, an object of pity, the embodiment of shame. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My face was burning, but I didn't let the tears fall, not in front of my son. Not in front of them. My fingers gripped the napkin as if it were a lifeline, and I looked around the room, hoping to find at least one look that looked like sympathy. My grandfather stared at his plate. My cousin grinned at her phone screen. Even my uncle, the one who once said that I reminded him of my late father, did not look up. Luca looked lost. His small eyebrows furrowed, expressing embarrassment and pain, and that look, full of childish bewilderment and helplessness, turned out to be what broke me completely. Not words, not laughter, not a feeling of shame as heavy as lead, but he, my child, who watched all this with quiet horror, trying to somehow understand why his mother, a woman who strokes his hair in the evenings and tells tales about brave heroes, kissed his skinned knees, and I spent late at night poring over the multiplication table with him, and today I found myself a laughingstock among people who call themselves her family, and this misunderstanding in his eyes pierced me more keenly than any insults. I wanted to leave, get up, grab Luca by the hand and, without looking back, walk through these endless tables, through arches of flowers and dazzling lights, as if through a maze in which I had been lost for a long time, but still hoped to find a way out. I wanted to take my son away from this scene, where I was humiliated again and again under the veil of secular smiles, but something inside me was wavering. Some old, poorly healed wound began to burn, as if salt had been poured on it again, and I realized that I wanted to speak out, that I had to, not only for the sake of for myself, but also for Luke, for the woman I'd become, no matter what. I wanted to tell them that they didn't know the half of what I had to go through, hadn't heard those nights when I cried into my pillow from exhaustion, loneliness, and fear, hadn't seen how I learned to put myself back together every morning. But my mouth was dry, my tongue felt heavy as a stone, and my legs were shaking under the table, as if I was on the edge of a cliff, not daring to take a step forward. Before I could move, there was the creak of a chair being pushed back in the hall, as if someone had scratched the surface of reality, and all heads turned in unison. David, the groom, Beatrice's perfect fiancé, slowly stood up, pushing the chair back with icy precision. He didn't look surprised, as if he already knew or expected all this. He didn't look at Beatrice, didn't look for an explanation in her face, didn't look for support among the guests. His gaze was fixed directly on me, steady, intent, without a shadow of mockery or regret, and there was something in that look which made the whole room freeze, as if the atmosphere itself had shrunk from the tension. At that moment, I realized that something was going to happen, not salvation, not compassion, not a gesture of love, but a reckoning, a long, awaited, painful, necessary balancing of the scales, because all this had been accumulating for years, and perhaps now was the moment when the hidden must come out. People often think that being an older sister is a privilege, that you set the tone, become a model, and the younger ones follow you with trust and respect, but in our family I was more of a warning, a reminder of how not to, than something they wanted to be like. My name is Livia. I am 34 years old. I am a single mother, the white crow in a family that has always dressed up to the same expectations and crossed out those who did not fit into them. I live in a small 2-room apartment on the outskirts of the city, where the windows overlook the road where school buses pass in the morning, and at night you can hear the neighbor's dog barking. That's where Luca and I live. He's 8. He's the best thing that's ever happened to me, and the only reason I'm going back into rooms where I once felt insignificant is because he believes in me like no one else, and his faith keeps me going. I work 2 jobs. In the morning, I make coffee at a local cafe, where I know the tastes of regular customers by heart, and in the evening I stand at the reception desk in a small hotel, where I smile at tourists and sort out endless little things. Life isn't glamorous, but it's mine. On Saturdays, Luca and I bake pancakes. He calls them Mom's pancakes with superpowers, and every time he says I'm his superhero, I believe I can handle another day. But in our family, being a single mother meant only one thing: I failed, and my mother, Veronica, did everything possible to make me feel it at every family gathering, at every holiday, in every unsaid comment. She believes in looks, in facades, in shiny surfaces, in how others see us. And that's why Beatrice's wedding was not just a celebration for her, but an opportunity to demonstrate that the family is still worth something. She called it a second chance, as if Beatrice was redeeming our past mistakes with her luck. Beatrice is 5 years younger than me. She is beautiful, with a confident grace and that lightness that makes people think that everything she has is what she deserves. She's a golden child. Veronica loves her. If Beatrice sneezes, Mom rushes to her with a silk handkerchief. If I'm sick, she throws over her shoulder, "Take vitamins and stop being dramatic." When I got pregnant with Luca, everything changed. I was 25, and I was in love for real, for the first time, without looking back. The man I loved swore he would be there for me, called me his family. And then, in the 5th month of pregnancy, he disappeared. No note, no phone calls, just disappeared. My family didn't ask a single question. They didn't offer any help. They condemned me without words, with the grace of cutting a cake with a knife. But I had Luca. And when I picked him up for the first time, pink, tiny, warm, every humiliating word, every look full of contempt, became white noise. But somewhere deep inside, I still hoped that they would see me someday. Not just as a single mother, not as a mistake, not as a shameful chapter in the family annals, but as a woman who tried, fought, survived, and was worthy of love. Maybe that's why when I received an invitation to Beatrice's wedding, even if my name was misspelled, even if I didn't go to the wedding party, even if I had to rent a dress and wind my hair myself in front of the fogged bathroom mirror while Luca practiced smiling in his tie, I still said yes. I told myself that maybe this was a sign that they were ready to extend an olive branch. At least somehow. Just for one night. The venue was beautiful, and perhaps that even angered me the most. All this exquisite beauty, these white roses neatly woven into arches and garlands, cutlery with gold inserts, heavy, as if a reminder of the weight of traditions, and somewhere in the distance, almost imperceptibly, a string quartet playing, whose the sound, thin as a spider's web, spread through the hall, giving everything a touch of sophistication and importance, as if everything around was not just a celebration, but a carefully planned performance in which, for people like me, the role was predetermined, an extra without cues. Beatrice looked like she'd stepped out of the pages of a wedding magazine. Her dress flowed like water, her hair was immaculately styled, her makeup seemed light and natural, although it probably cost more than I earn in a month, and she was beaming and smiling, bathed in an endless stream of compliments, camera flashes, and odd stares, catching every bit of attention, as if it wasn't enough even for her. As she walked past me, or rather, past our table, which was in the shadows, on the periphery of the whole action, her radiance seemed to fade a little, and her smile faded, as if someone had run an eraser over it, leaving a barely noticeable crease on her forehead. "You did it," she said, and there was no surprise in her voice, just a poorly concealed condescension, as if she really hadn't expected me to come, not to snap, not to come in anything, not to make a scene. Then her gaze slid over Luke, and she added with the same learned neutrality, "He's getting big." No hugs, no real warmth, just social politeness, as if we weren't sisters, but colleagues at some kind of banquet reception, after which she disappeared back into the circle of admiring guests. Veronica, my mother, didn't recognize me at all, or pretended not to, which was basically the same thing. She walked past me with the kind of detached expression you might pass by a hotel cleaner without looking at me for a second, and I felt something inside tighten painfully, but it didn't give up. And Luca, my boy, my light, shone like a flashlight in a dark room. His eyes sparkled. He looked at the crystal chandelier and whispered in my ear that it looked like a spaceship from his favorite cartoon, and that Beatrice, just like the princess from the book we read before going to bed. And when I saw how happy he was just being here, how he absorbed this brilliance, not realizing yet what price he had paid, I decided to stay at the reception, despite everything that had already happened. Despite the sharp, familiar the pain is the heaviness that I once again found myself out of place. Once again I found myself a stranger among my own people. Our table turned out to be at number 9, at the very end of the hall, in the shade, next to the toilets and the entrance to the kitchen, so that waiters were constantly rushing past us with trays smelling of spices and alcohol, and I just smiled bitterly to myself, because it was appropriate, it was predictable, it's poetic. We ate salads. Luca picked at his plate while I carefully helped him with his tie, on which he dropped a spoon with chocolate mousse, and he giggled, and I pretended that I was enjoying it all, while avoiding eye contact with Veronica and trying not to listen to the whispers at the neighboring tables, when, in the pauses between toasts, my name came up through the clink of glasses and fake compliments. Then the speeches began, and I immediately realized that this evening would not be a celebration of reconciliation, it would not be a bridge between the past and the future, it would not become a new page for us. No, It was another performance, another act in which Beatrice could prove herself, and I knew in advance what role she had given me. It all started out like most wedding speeches, warm, cloying, a little pompous, as if memorized from a mirror. Beatrice stood up with perfect posture, as if she were practicing ballet. A glass of champagne sparkled in her immaculately manicured hand, and her dress shimmered softly in the chandelier light as silence slowly descended in the hall, the kind that always precedes public exposure or confession. She paused briefly, long enough for everyone to pay attention, then said with a perfectly measured intonation, "I want to thank all of you for being here. This is the happiest day of my life, and I'm surrounded by people who mean everything to me." I watched her from my seat at the far end of the room, trying to convince myself that maybe this was about me, maybe I meant something to her, too. Luca was sitting next to her, on the edge of a chair, as if afraid to soil the day with his spontaneity, swinging his legs and looking at Beatrice with awe, as if she were a sorceress, as if she were a fairy tale. She continued talking about David, about love, about fate, about time. It was all beautiful, even touching, and without noticing how I relaxed a little, I allowed myself to hope that maybe this time everything would be okay, that there would be no pain. But then she moved, and I immediately felt this movement, like a blow to the skin. "And, of course," she said with that sly smile that I would have recognized in the dark, "I want to express my gratitude to my older sister." The spotlight has moved. All eyes turned to me, as if on cue. I straightened up and smiled politely, but inside everything was tense, as if before a fall. Her voice was soft, but there was mockery in every intonation, carefully disguised as admiration. "You've always been such a shining example," she said, and I almost grinned because I knew what was coming next. "She's the bravest woman I know," Beatrice continued. "She raised a child on her own. No husband, no partner. Just her. Well, and someone who was kind enough to babysit sometimes." A chuckle rang out in the audience, dry, light, but already hurting. My stomach clenched, as if from a sharp cold. "But seriously," she added, "it's incredible how she does it. A single mother. Not needed by anyone. But it still appears." Laughter. A really loud, harsh, undisguised laugh, and at that moment I felt my breath leave my body. My cheeks were flushed. My hands froze on the napkin in my lap, as if it could protect me. I looked at Luca. He frowned and looked around in confusion, not understanding why everyone was laughing. Over his mom. And then the worst began, and if up to that moment I was still trying to hold on, at least outwardly, at least for Luke's sake, now even that thin, barely perceptible mask cracked like an old porcelain cup, because my mother, Veronica, was laughing the loudest, not hiding, not restraining herself, as if this was the most successful moment of celebration, the culmination of a celebration that she had been planning for years. She leaned over to her neighbors at the table, some familiar couple from her circle, people with the same voices and the same smiles, and added, just loud enough to be heard over the general hum, so that her voice could confidently cut through the noise and solidify what Beatrice had said as the truth. She was second hand, but it's still well polished. And then the laughter, a new wave, loud, prickly, without the slightest hesitation, scattered through the hall like a broken glass, filling the space with such a ringing that you wanted to hide under the table. For a second, my vision blurred, everything in front of my eyes seemed to flash and go out, like an old screen, and I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach, but no one touched me, neither with his hand nor with his eyes. Everyone around was just laughing, as if it was natural, as if it was acceptable to humiliate a woman who had worked tirelessly for almost 10 years, without complaining, without asking, to raise her son with dignity, with love, with hope, and as if her loneliness made her something less than human. I looked at Luca. His smile had disappeared, his lips were trembling, he frowned and leaned over to me, whispering with an anxious, confused voice, "Why did she say that? What does she mean by that?" And I felt everything inside me shrink, as if my heart was wrapped in wire, and I wanted to answer. I should have said something, but there were no words left in me. There was no air left to protect him at that moment, to protect him from the way our family saw me. It's hard to hide such pain, you can't push it back. You can't cover it with a joke or a smile. My heart began to beat faster, as if trying to run forward, away from this room where humiliation had become an applauded spectacle. I looked around the room for an exit, someone who could stand up, intervene, say enough is enough, put an end to this silent lynching, but no one did it. Some of the guests looked confused, yes, but it was just an expression on their faces. Their hands remained on their glasses, their eyes glided over their phone screens, they just looked away, and there was even more cruelty in this than in the laughter itself. Even Grandpa Innocenzo, who called me his little lion when I was a girl and crawled around the garden looking for tits, the same grandpa who held my hand when I fell off my bike, now stared at his plate as if I were a stranger, and he was there, but he wasn't with me. By me, not at this moment, not when I needed him the most. And so I was left alone again, as it had been many times before, and if everything had concerned only me, I would have been able to accept it. I would have gone through it, as I had gone through it before. I would have just smiled, taken Luke by the hand and quietly, with dignity, would have gone into the night, leaving behind this glittering farce. But the moment I saw the confusion in my son's eyes, his attempt to understand why people who were clapping their hands and filling the air with toasts and congratulations suddenly started laughing at his mother, whom he knew as strong, kind, caring, invincible, then something in me cracked. I stood up, not because I knew what I was going to say, and not because I wanted to make a scene. No, I just needed to get out of this room. I needed to breathe without choking on the shame that they had so easily hung on my shoulders like a new brooch. I pushed back my chair, grabbed the tablecloth with trembling hands, and was about to move away when I suddenly heard another chair creak, this time from behind the main table. David, the groom, the perfect groom, the man who looked like he was being molded into an advertising sample of his spouse, stood up. His face was pale as porcelain, and there was no trace of the smile that had blossomed at the altar an hour ago. His jaw was tense, as if he was holding back something dangerous. Without a word, he took the microphone from Beatrice, and at the same moment there was silence in the hall, so deep that it seemed as if the air had thickened, as before a thunderstorm. There was no more laughter, no more whispering. Everyone froze. They felt that something was about to happen that was not part of the evening's plan, and I knew it would not be another joke, it would not be a settlement. David stood with one hand on the table, the other clasped around the microphone, and his gaze did not slip around the room, did not linger on Beatrice or Veronica, did not turn to the laughing crowd. He looked only at me, intently, firmly, with an expression that I could not decipher at first. Anger? Disappointment? Maybe even disgust? For a second, I thought he was going to try to smooth things over, too, make a joke, say something conciliatory. That's what our family usually does, sweep everything under the carpet, call humiliation a tradition, a joke, a way to maintain the atmosphere. But he didn't smile. He wasn't laughing. His face remained serious, almost gloomy. Before he could say anything, I was already reaching for Luke's hand, pushing back my chair, ready to leave quietly, with dignity, not giving anyone the pleasure of seeing me break down or cry. I've done this before. I could do it again. But when I turned around, about to leave this room, I heard his voice, low, confident, calm. "Livia, don't leave." That stopped me. Everyone turned to him as if on cue, and for several endless seconds the room was filled with such tension that even breathing seemed like a betrayal. A whisper swept across the tables, light as the wind on dry autumn leaves, uncertain but growing, and in this hum there was not interest, but anxiety, as if none of those present knew what to expect from the next moment. Beatrice tensed, her hands, always graceful, were now clenched into fists, and her lips were pressed into a thin, barely noticeable line, and even her dress, which had previously played with light, now looked heavy, almost stubborn in its immobility. Veronica squinted, as if to make sure she was still in control of the situation, even though the air had already changed, and even she felt control slipping away. The DJ, who was sitting in the corner, reached for the volume controls, preparing to return the atmosphere, but stopped when David, still standing, raised his hand, a quiet gesture, but so confident that no one dared to break his silence. He didn't look at anyone but me. "I can't pretend that I'm happy with what just happened," he said, his voice steady, without trembling, but there was a hardness in every word, like a stone that falls into the water and sinks, leaving ripples in its wake. "I'm not going to stand here and pass off this kind of cruelty as a comedy." The audience held its breath, literally, as if someone had turned off the air, and even the spoons froze in flight, as if the whole mechanism of the celebration had stopped. David left the table, walking slowly, almost solemnly, as if every movement was an effort, as if he were breaking through the viscosity of an atmosphere filled with guilt and pretense. He stopped at our table, where Luca and I, in front of half-eaten salads and half-drunk glasses of water, sat in silence, as if we were strangers at this celebration. Over the past year, while I was planning this wedding, I've heard a lot about the family, he continued, without taking his eyes off me. About the appearance. About traditions. About loyalty. But what I just saw was not a manifestation of family. It was a mockery disguised as a celebration. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, as if someone had run a cold hand over everyone's back. Some of the guests stole glances at Veronica, others preferred to stare into their glasses, while others pretended to check their phones. But no one said a word. David turned to Beatrice. You bullied your sister for being a single mother raising a child without outside help. You laughed. And to make matters worse, you let her son watch it. You let him see adults laughing at his mother. Beatrice opened her mouth, but her voice was stuck somewhere inside, as if her tongue refused to obey her, and something like fear flashed in her eyes. David did not wait for an answer. She didn't ask to be put in that position. But she came. She sat down at the back table. She smiled. She brought her son to witness your day. And you turned it into a joke. Until that moment, I had never seen Beatrice so small, not physically, but internally, as if her confidence, like an outfit, had been taken off and hung on a hanger. David turned to the room. She's not standing here to protect herself. She doesn't ask for your sympathy. She never needed a stage. But I will not be silent. Because if I'm going to marry a girl from a family where cruelty is called humor and shame is a tradition, I need to rethink what kind of man I want to be. The audience gasped, and the woman at the next table whispered, "Is it true?" Someone dropped a fork, and the sound of it falling sounded deafening in this deathly silence. Luca looked at me, eyes wide, and there was so much surprise and hope in his gaze that for the first time that evening I felt something like warmth coming out from under my skin. I came here hoping to just get through the evening. I didn't expect anyone to stand up and stand up for me. Not like that. Not in front of everyone. David looked at Luke and nodded slightly, with the confidence that only people have when they really understand what's at stake. Your mom is the strongest person in this room. Don't forget that. Then he turned to the crowd one last time. I think I've seen enough. And with that, he put the microphone on the edge of the stage, walked past Beatrice without even deigning to glance at her, and headed for the door. I froze, still holding Luca's hand, feeling his small fingers clenched tightly in mine. The music didn't start. The crowd did not move. It was as if someone had drained all the air out of the room. The fairy tale, carefully played out by Beatrice, was shattered, and no one knew how to fix it. But for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't stay broken. At that moment, when David came out of the reception hall, it was as if someone had flipped a switch. No one applauded. No one was jubilant. The only sound was the monotonous hum of the air conditioner and the clink of a spoon hitting a glass. The crowd froze, eyes darting between me, Beatrice, and the door, through which the man who had said out loud what they had refused to admit for years had disappeared. Beatrice stood at the main table, her perfect posture cracked, and for the first time I saw her shoulders slump under the weight of what was happening. She looked around for support, but the faces facing her were no longer smiling. Some were shocked. Some are confused. And some of them are clearly angry. Not like David. At her. Veronica spoke first. She stood up abruptly, like a spring released too quickly, and her chair creaked back across the polished floor, betraying not so much annoyance as confusion. What an ungrateful boy. Her voice sounded too harsh, too desperate, to be convincing. He embarrassed you in front of everyone. Typical, like your sister, egoist. But even I, who was used to her taunts, heard a crack in those words, not strength, and for the first time in all these years I realized that the power she had held over this room for so long, over all of us, was gone. Her words did not make an impression, nor did they elicit a nod of agreement or a sympathetic glance. They hung in the air and settled into dust. I didn't answer. And, to my surprise, I didn't need it. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like cowering under her voice. My hands didn't shake, my throat didn't constrict. I just looked at Luke, who looked up at me uncertainly. "Are we leaving?" he whispered, and in his voice there was not so much expectation as a request. "Yes, baby," I replied, gently brushing a lock of blonde hair from his forehead. "We're going home." I straightened up, feeling something slowly spreading its wings inside me, and took his hand tightly. We walked to the exit, and people parted, as if it was me who was now moving in the center of the scene, and not Beatrice in her dress. Some avoided my gaze, as if they were afraid to face their own shame. Others, on the contrary, looked as if they wanted to say something, to apologize, to regret, to admit, but they couldn't find the words, and the silence hung over us like the evening air before a thunderstorm. Halfway to the door, I heard someone say my name softly, "Livia." I turned around. It was my grandfather Innocenzo. Pale, with eyes red from exertion, he slowly got up from his seat, as if all the life in his body had suddenly become a tangible weight, and took a step towards me. "I'm sorry," he said softly, in a trembling, almost inaudible voice. "I should have stopped this years ago." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, not because the words stuck, but because I knew nothing I could say would undo what had already happened. But I wasn't mad at him. I didn't hate him for being silent. I understood what silence was worth to some people, understood how it was chosen not out of cruelty, but out of weakness. And I got over it. And maybe that's why I didn't feel guilty anymore. I didn't feel like I had to forgive. Simply, I didn't feel anything for this silence. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, the kind that happens only after rain, which did not happen, but which seemed to be expected. Luca tightened his grip on my hand. "Is the wedding over?" "What is it?" he asked, looking up at the gray, calm sky. "Yes," I replied, smiling. "I think everything ended exactly as it should have." We drove home in silence. The radio was off, and only the rhythmic hum of tires and the tapping of Luke's fingers on the armrest were the only sounds filling the car. I didn't feel angry, I didn't feel triumphant. It was just tiredness and a new kind of calmness, as if I had come out of the water I was drowning in. That night, I put Luca to bed, kissed him on the forehead, covered him up to his chin, and lingered at the door a little longer than usual. He didn't ask a single question, and he didn't need to. He understood everything. And maybe he understood even more than he would have liked. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of vibration. The phone, littered on the bedside table, showed a dozen missed calls. The rooms were unknown, the names were distant relatives, and some were from guests I barely remembered. I haven't called back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't see the point. The phone vibrated again. A message from an old friend, one of the few who attended the wedding. Someone recorded David's speech. "She's already on Facebook. More than 50,000 views. You need to see the comments. People are behind you." I opened the video. Here it is, a shot in which David stands with a microphone, his voice calm and direct, sounding like the truth. And here I am, standing next to Luke, holding his hand tightly, at the entrance, with a face in which there are no tears or fear. The comments were like waves rolling in with renewed vigor. "This man is a hero. She deserved better." I'm crying looking at this. Every mom has just received a piece of justice. I didn't cry. I wasn't smiling either. I just felt like something that had been squeezing inside me for years was letting go with every word, not loudly, not instantly, but slowly, deeply, with roots. Last week, Beatrice tried to turn things around. She claimed that David overreacted, that it was just a joke, that people are too sensitive now. But the truth had already come out, and no one was laughing anymore. A few days later, there was a small bouquet of wildflowers on the mat at the door of my apartment, not bright, not flashy, but with the scent of real summer. No note, just a small card with one word, Lioness. I didn't have to ask who it was from. The wedding did not take place. But something more happened. For the first time in many years, the shame wasn't on me. I didn't have to apologize. I didn't have to explain. I left that room with my son, with dignity, with my head held high, with the right not to be the object of silent pity. And somewhere out there, in the hall where laughter once sounded, someone finally reminded the whole room, and maybe the entire internet, what it really means to be strong. 6 months had passed since the wedding, which never took place, and although the word wedding was no longer spoken aloud in our family, its absence hovered in conversations like an understatement that framed every meeting and every call, as if someone had tried to carve the whole day out of memory, but left the edges blurred, and they were still hurting. Beatrice and David officially ended their engagement. There was no loud statement, no drama, no photos and tears, not even another post with the caption "Everything is for the best." Just silence, sterile, empty, like a white sheet on which it should have been written, and they lived happily ever after. Beatrice returned to her social circle as if nothing had happened, with the same flawless makeup, the same immaculate dinners, the same mirror-like gloss on Instagram, only the photos from that evening disappeared from her feed so suddenly, as if they had never happened, as if the whole story was not a mistake. And a glitch in the algorithm. She didn't contact me, and I'm not sure if I expected this, not because I didn't hope, but because I no longer needed her words. Veronica called one day. Her voice was flat and cold, as if she was calling to remind me of a debt or a missed family commitment, and not to apologize at all, no. Her only message was that I had disgraced the family because I didn't laugh with them, because I ruined the evening with my silence. I listened to her for exactly 30 seconds, counting down in my head each one you should have and each one we didn't take it that way, and then, before she could finish her next sentence, she said something I thought I'd never have the courage to do: "I'm not your scapegoat anymore," and hung up the phone. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was clear, simple, and final, like a dot at the end of a letter. After everything that happened, I realized that I didn't need apologies, loud or even sincere. I didn't need them to suddenly wake up and start seeing me as a person they had previously refused to notice. All I needed was to stop waiting for permission to feel my worth, to stop putting myself in the waiting room for someone else's recognition. My life didn't change overnight. I still worked long hours, rushed between morning shifts at the cafe and evening shifts at the hotel. I still sometimes cooked 2 dinners because Luca wanted pancakes with syrup and I wanted stewed broccoli with lemon, and yet there was something new in this routine. I no longer walked hunched over under the weight of invisible shame, did not hide in the shadows, did not apologize for my presence. Luca had changed too. Now he asked more questions, smart, important ones, the ones that make adults slow down and reconsider their answers. He wanted to know why some people are cruel and others are brave, why someone laughs when someone cries, and why David, according to him, looks like a hero from Marvel movies, and sometimes he played with toys, as if he was performing in front of an audience, protecting a little man, and I understood that night he saw something that forever shaped his view of justice, bravery, and strength. One evening, when we were brushing our teeth and foam was covering his chin, he looked at me in the mirror and asked, "Mom, are you still sad because of what Aunt Beatrice said?" I paused, allowing myself to remember not the words, but the feeling they left, and replied, "Not anymore." "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, smearing the paste on his cheek. "Because I think you won, even though it wasn't a fight," and I froze, because there was more truth in those words than in all my previous attempts to explain to myself what happened then. He was right. I didn't scream, I didn't insult in response, I didn't demand justice, I didn't cry in public or make a scene. I just got up, took my son by the hand and left, and someone else, someone I didn't ask, stood up and said enough is enough. David didn't just stand up for me, he reminded everyone in that room that love is not rings, bouquets, or altar vows, but the ability to say no, not today, when someone is hurting. And if I've learned anything this year, it's this: loneliness doesn't mean you're not needed, kindness doesn't make you weak, and dignity, once found, is an anchor that can no longer be torn off. No, I didn't dance at my sister's wedding, I didn't make toasts, I didn't catch a bouquet or cry with happiness under the garlands, but I left with something more, with the right to be myself, with my head held high, with my son by my side and with an inner voice that no longer trembles. It was a finale that no one expected, but it was exactly the one I deserved. And if this story has touched you, if you've ever felt unnoticed in a room full of those who should have been there, know this: your voice matters, Your dignity matters, and you are not alone. If this story has given you strength, please like it, share it with those who need it, and leave a comment. I would like to know if there was a moment in your life when someone stood up for you. Or when did you find the strength to stand up yourself? And if you want more stories that really mean something, subscribe. Thank you for being here.